So picture the modernization race of the 18th century. It's the absolute dawn of the industrial era.
Right.
The exact moment human history is just about to pivot forever. You've got France on one side, and you've got Great Britain on the other.
Yeah.
And if you were sitting in a tavern in 1720, and you were placing bets on which nation would conquer the future,
Yeah, you'd bet on France.
you would be an absolute fool not to put every single penny you owned on France. I mean, think about their advantages. They had massive, just sprawling natural resources.
Huge population advantage, too.
Exactly. And they were the literal center of the Enlightenment. So they had access to the exact same brilliant scientific minds,
Yeah.
the same engineering breakthroughs, the physics, the math, everything the British had.
They had the coal in the ground.
Right. They had the coal, they had the fierce ambition of a global empire. And yet, in the actual race to industrialize, France just gets utterly, completely crushed.
They're left choking in the dust for an entire century.
For a century. And why? Because we always assume, it was about who had the better steam engine or who built the most efficient factories.
Shiny hardware.
The hardware, right.
Mm.
But what if the real secret weapon of the Industrial Revolution wasn't made of iron at all? What if it wasn't powered by coal? What if the reason France lost and Britain took over the globe came down to just old, yellowed, completely unchangeable pieces of parchment?
I mean, it completely upends how we are taught history. We are so heavily conditioned to think of the Industrial Revolution as a story of, technological hardware.
Yeah.
You picture the spinning jennies, the blast furnaces.
Big smokestacks.
Exactly. Steam locomotives roaring across the countryside. But those physical inventions, they're just the hardware. You can have all the hardware in the world, but if your operating system is fundamentally broken, the machine just won't boot up.
Oh, that's such a good way to put it.
Yeah, and what we are exploring today is that invisible software. We're looking at a brilliantly counterintuitive concept, the hidden, highly bureaucratic reorganization of property rights.
Okay, let's unpack this because that software analogy is perfect. History books, they always show us the shiny factories, right? But they completely hide the legal operating system running in the background.
Always.
Imagine someone handing you a next-generation smartphone, just the most powerful piece of technology ever created. But when you turn it on, you realize someone installed Windows 95 on it.
It's going to crash immediately.
It's going to crash. The hardware is totally useless if the software can't route the power or manage the memory or just adapt to new apps. And that was continental Europe in the 1700s.
They had the technological hardware, sure, but their legal software was stuck in the Middle Ages.
Stuck. But Britain somehow figured out how to write a patch. They figured out how to update their operating system in real time. And today, for our deep dive, we have our hands on a pile of data that finally proves exactly how they pulled it off.
It's fascinating.
We're digging into a working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's by economists Daniel Bogart and Gary Richardson. And what they've done is they've literally put 18th century history under a quantitative microscope.
Their mission in this research is just staggering in its scope. I mean, they aren't just sitting back and theorizing about historical vibes or, philosophical shifts.
Right.
They combed through tens of thousands of individual private acts passed by the British Parliament between the years 1700 and 1830.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah. They built this massive data set to prove that the true engine of the British Empire wasn't some lone genius in a patent office inventing a new gear. It was actually a highly bureaucratic, heavily documented, and fiercely negotiated legal channel.
Those are paperwork.
Basically, yeah. They argued that the British Parliament functioned as an incredibly elastic market. It was completely restructuring who owned what land, and more importantly, what they were legally allowed to do with it.
Which, sounds incredibly dry until you realize the sheer suffocating drama of the world they were actually living in.
Oh, it was a nightmare.
It really was. To appreciate how Britain broke the rules and launched the modern world, we first have to fully understand the terrifying legal prison that everyone in pre-industrial Europe was trapped inside.
The ancestors' curse.
The curse of the ancestors, exactly. Because pre-industrial property rights were an absolute horror show. The land, which was the primary source of wealth in the world, was practically frozen in amber.
Walk us through the mechanics of this trap. What exactly was a strict settlement?
So the strict settlement is the perfect example of how a legal framework can literally strangle a nation's economy. When we imagine the English countryside back in the 17th or 18th century, we usually picture wealthy aristocratic lords just doing whatever they please with their vast rolling estates.
Right, the lords of the manor. absolute power.
But the reality on the ground was the exact opposite. Between 1/4 and a staggering 3/4 of all arable land in England was legally locked inside these strict settlements.
Wait, I need to pause on that number. Up to 3/4 of the country. Up to 75%, yeah.
That is a massive, almost incomprehensible chunk of the nation's core economic asset, just locked up.
It was completely pervasive. And a strict settlement was essentially a multi-generational legal straitjacket. Let's imagine a wealthy grandfather in the year 1650 drafting a settlement for his estate.
Okay.
His primary psychological drive is preservation. He wants to ensure that the estate stays perfectly intact for his son, his grandson, his great-grandson. He wants to protect the family name, prevent anyone from squandering the wealth, and just keep the property unified forever.
Makes sense on a human level.
It does. But by writing that ironclad legal protection into the deed, he legally reduced every future landowner, the actual living, breathing person residing in the manor house, to a mere life tenant.
A life tenant. So you're basically a babysitter who can be sued by the baby.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
You live in the giant house, but you don't actually own it in any meaningful modern sense. You're just holding on to it until you die and pass to the next guy.
You had absolute zero power over the core asset. As a life tenant, you could not sell a single acre to raise cash.
Not 1 acre.
Not one. You could not take the deed to a bank and mortgage the land to raise capital for a new business venture. You couldn't even sign a long-term lease with a tenant farmer.
Wait, really? Why couldn't you sign a lease?
Because a lease that lasted longer than your own natural life was considered a direct legal violation of your unborn heir's future rights. You were legally forbidden from making any decision that outlasted your own heartbeat.
Okay, let's ground this in a physical scenario to really get the slap-in-the-face feeling of this. Let's say I am an 18th century lord. I am walking my massive estate, and I trip over a huge exposed seam of coal.
Okay.
The Industrial Revolution is whispering in the air. Factories are starting to need fuel. I want to hire workers, sink a shaft, and build a coal mine. Are you telling me I just can't do it?
You absolutely cannot touch that coal.
But it's on my land.
Doesn't matter. If your grandfather's 17th century settlement did not explicitly authorize the mining of minerals, and they almost never did, because coal wasn't a major economic driver back when the document was drafted, digging that mine would be legally classified under a concept called waste.
Waste. Digging coal is waste.
Legally, yes. By mining the coal, you are converting a permanent physical piece of the estate into current spendable income for yourself. In the eyes of the law, you are robbing your future grandson of his inheritance.
Wow.
If you so much as put a shovel in the ground, your own relatives, the trustees of the estate, or even distant cousins could drag you into the court of chancery and hit you with devastating lawsuits for damages.
That is insane.
You couldn't cut down a stand of old-growth timber to sell the wood. You couldn't drain a useless swamp to plant new, highly profitable crops. You are completely paralyzed by the dead hand of your ancestor.
Hang on, though. We're calling this a prison and a curse, but let's look at it from the grandfather's perspective for a second. Stopping a reckless, 19-year-old heir from gambling away the family farm in a card game, or protecting the core wealth from a terrible business investment. Isn't that actually incredibly smart?
It's very protective.
Yeah, there is a certain romance and honestly a lot of logic to protecting your family's future like that. Why is this sudden desire to liquidate everything being framed by the researchers as a necessary good?
It is a totally valid perspective, and the intention behind the law was purely protective. But the paper forces us to look at the brutal macroeconomic reality that this protection actually created. When a nation's legal code values rigid tradition over elasticity, the entire society basically suffocates.
How so?
Because wealth creation on a national scale is not about hoarding assets in a vault. It is about the velocity and flow of assets. If you cannot freely use your land, you cannot adapt to changing reality. Imagine the price of wheat skyrockets because the population is booming and people desperately need bread. You own a massive sheep pasture. The market is screaming for wheat, but you are legally forbidden from plowing your pasture to plant grain because it would alter the traditional nature of the estate.
So the society literally starves while the land just sits there, green and useless.
Exactly. Protection, taken to its absolute dogmatic extreme, becomes economic paralysis.
That paints a terrifying picture.
Mm-hmm.
The wealthy elites are trapped in their own manners by their grandfathers. But what about the poor? What about the regular farmers? Because the paper makes it clear that this paralysis infected the bottom of the pyramid just as badly. They talk about the village prison or the open field nightmare.
Yeah, the elites had the strict settlements, but the commoners had the open field system. At the start of the 18th century, roughly 25% of all arable land in England was locked in what were called common field or open field villages.
This was a holdover from medieval times.
A direct holdover from the medieval agricultural system.
When most of us picture a farm, we picture a square piece of land with a fence around it, owned by one family.
And a nice, neat little box.
Exactly. But that isn't what this was. Explain the physical layout of an open field village, because it's so weird.
Throw away the image of the fenced-in farm entirely. Imagine a massive, sprawling landscape surrounding a village, totally devoid of fences or hedges. This land was divided into hundreds, sometimes thousands, of long, incredibly narrow strips.
Like a giant barcode.
Exactly like a barcode. A single villager did not own a contiguous block of land. Instead, they possessed the customary right to farm, say, 30 different narrow strips scattered completely at random across the entire village territory.
So your strip of wheat might be sandwiched right between the strips of two different neighbors.
Right, and after the harvest was brought in, the rules dictated that the entire sprawling field instantly became a common pasture. Everyone in the village could let their sheep and cattle roam freely to graze on the stubble.
So it's all shared.
They shared the woods for firewood, they shared the water access, the grazing lands. Every single aspect of daily survival was managed by ancient customary laws and local manorial courts.
Which, honestly, on paper sounds incredibly communal. It sounds idyllic, very much like the Shire in Lord of the Rings.
Very romantic.
Everyone sharing the land, working together. But the paper takes an absolute sledgehammer to that illusion.
The illusion crumbles the second you introduce the concept of change. Because of how interwoven everyone's property rights were, making any sort of physical improvement to the land required a terrifying decision-making process.
Give me an example.
Let's say the fields are located in a slight depression, and every spring they flood, rotting the roots of the crops. You, a forward-thinking villager, propose digging a deep drainage ditch across the fields to save the harvest. Or maybe you want to introduce clover into the crop rotation because you learned it restores vital nitrogen to the soil.
Basic agricultural improvements.
Very basic. But under the traditional rules of the open field system, you needed consent to do this. And not just a simple majority vote. Any significant alteration to the physical layout or the agricultural cycle required unanimous consent.
Unanimous, like 100% of the villagers have to agree.
Every single person who held a property right in that village had to say yes.
That's a trap.
It's a massive trap. Imagine a village of 200 stakeholders. 199 of them are begging to build the drainage ditch because their crops are dying and their children are literally hungry. But one person, perhaps a stubborn elder who hates you or someone who simply fears change, says, "No, my grandfather farmed in the mud and I will farm in the mud."
And what happened?
The project is instantly dead. It was the ultimate collective prisoner's dilemma. One obstructionist holdout could kill an entire town's progress.
That is the ultimate slap in the face to our modern sensibilities. I mean, we champion democracy and consensus, but absolute consensus is basically a suicide pact for progress.
It absolutely is.
You are handing absolute veto power to the most stubborn, least visionary, most fearful person in the room. And this veto power didn't stop at the village borders, did it? This exact same paralysis applied to the infrastructure, the actual physical arteries connecting the country.
Oh, the physical infrastructure of 17th century England was a disaster. The roads were little more than deeply rutted dirt tracks that turned into muddy death traps the moment it rained.
Just swamps.
Carts would literally sink to their axles and just be abandoned. The rivers, which should have been the highways of commerce, were clogged with silt, weeds, old fishing weirs, making them completely unnavigable for large cargo boats, and the entities in charge of fixing them were completely toothless.
Who was in charge?
You had parish councils in charge of the roads, and regional bodies with the incredible name of the Commissions of Sewers in charge of the rivers.
The Commission of Sewers. That sounds like a powerful, imposing bureaucratic agency. But reading the source material, they were basically just neighborhood watch groups with zero actual authority.
Their powers were strictly limited to maintaining the status quo. A commission of sewers could legally compel a farmer to clear the reeds off his specific section of the riverbank. They could levy a tiny local tax to pay for basic dredging. but they fundamentally lacked the one legal superpower necessary to build modern infrastructure.
And what is that?
Eminent domain.
Okay, let's define that clearly, because it is the crux of the whole infrastructure problem. Eminent domain is the power of the state to force a private citizen to sell their property.
Exactly that. The traditional commissions absolutely could not force a sale. Let's say a river makes a sharp hairpin turn and large coal barges keep getting stuck. The obvious engineering solution is to dig a straight channel across the bend.
Sure.
But that bend is owned by a local gentleman farmer who likes having the river right next to his house. The commission cannot force him to sell that land. They cannot widen the river.
So the barges just stay stuck.
Forever. If a parish wants to build a new, wider paved road to connect to a booming market town, but the optimal route crosses the private hunting grounds of a local aristocrat who refuses to allow wagons near his estate,
The road simply isn't built.
it's not built. The coal doesn't reach the cities to heat homes, the grain doesn't reach the markets, and the cities face localized starvation. All because the law was fanatically dedicated to protecting the obstructionist rights of the traditional landowner.
It's mind-blowing. The whole country is wrapped in a legal straitjacket. The rich can't liquidate their estates because of their dead grandfathers. The poor can't improve their farms because of their stubborn neighbors. And the government can't build a single road to connect them all.
Complete gridlock.
This is the bottleneck. So the ultimate question is, how did Britain get out of this trap without tearing the country apart? Because France eventually faced this exact same gridlock, and their solution was to burn the whole system to the ground in a bloody, violent revolution.
Right, the French Revolution.
They started chopping off heads and seizing land by force. But Britain didn't do that. Britain wrote paperwork.
They engineered a political machine that unintentionally evolved into the most efficient property hacking mechanism in human history. And the genesis of this machine traces back to a political event, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Now, when we usually hear about 1688, it's taught as a purely political constitutional story. The parliament rises up, they limit the divine right of the king, they draft a Bill of Rights, establish a constitutional
Or
monarchy.
it's standard textbook stuff.
Right. But the economists in this paper are pointing out that checking the king's power was just the preamble. The real magic was the mundane, bureaucratic machinery Parliament built with its newly won supremacy.
Following 1688, Parliament became the undisputed supreme authority in Great Britain. But the crucial shift was procedural. They began meeting annually.
Which was new.
It's very new. Prior to this, a monarch might only convene Parliament once a decade, usually when they were desperate to raise taxes to fight a foreign war. But now, Parliament is sitting in London every single year. And because they are permanent, they establish a highly organized, predictable bureaucracy. They created a structured machine designed specifically to process petitions from ordinary civilians.
This is where the operating system update actually happens. This wasn't just a group of wealthy men debating foreign policy and shouting at each other about the national debt.
Yeah.
They deliberately set up a system to rewrite local, individual property laws on demand.
Yes.
And they did it through three massive pillars of legislative reform. Let's walk through these three pillars because this is how you hack a country out of the Middle Ages. Pillar number one, the Estate Acts.
Estate Acts were the silver bullet designed specifically to slay the ancestors' curse. Let's return to our life tenant, trapped in the manor house, unable to mine the coal or sell the land because of his grandfather's 17th century will.
Right, the guy with a coal mine.
Under this new parliamentary system, that life tenant could hire a specialized lawyer, meticulously draft a petition explaining his economic hardship and the potential value of the land, and submit it directly to Parliament.
And then what?
The petition would be assigned to a committee, often involving judges and members of the House of Lords. They would review the math. If they agreed that restructuring the estate would increase its overall value and ultimately benefit the family lineage, Parliament would pass a bespoke, totally private law, an Estate Act, that literally annulled the restrictive clauses of the dead ancestor's will.
It's a legal time machine.
Yeah.
You were literally getting the supreme government of the nation to overrule your ghost grandfather. You get a piece of paper that says, "Sorry, Grandpa, Parliament has officially declared that I can mine the coal."
Estate Acts were a mechanism for instant legal liberation. The moment the act received royal assent, the life tenant bypassed the restrictions. Suddenly, they could sell off outlying acreage to raise massive amounts of capital. They could secure heavy mortgages to build factories. They could sign ironclad 99-year leases with developers.
It instantly unlocked the massive frozen capital reserves of the British elite.
Exactly.
Okay, that handles the elites.
Yeah.
Pillar number two, Statutory Authority Acts. The name is aggressively boring, but this is the infrastructure superpower.
This is the legal hammer that smashed the transportation bottlenecks. A Statutory Authority Act was a law that created a brand new specialized organization. This could be a nonprofit trust, or it could be a for-profit corporation.
Like who?
Think of the famous turnpike trusts that built the toll roads, or the massive canal companies, or the urban improvement commissions that paved and lit the streets of cities. Crucially, when Parliament passed one of these acts, they granted the new organization the very superpower that the old commissions of sewers lack.
Eminent domain.
Eminent domain.
The power to force the sale. The power to run roughshod over the local holdout.
They gave them the legal right to smash through local paralysis. If a newly formed canal company had a Statutory Authority Act in their hands, they could legally compel any landowner along the route to sell the right-of-way for a fair market price.
So that aristocrat, who liked his hunting grounds.
If he refused to sell, a legally appointed local commission would step in, praise the land, hand the aristocrat a bag of money, and the canal was dug right through his property whether he liked it or not.
Wow.
It allowed these private companies to levy tolls to pay back investors, issue bonds to raise capital, and physically terraform the nation.
And then we reach pillar number 3, the Enclosure Acts. This is the one that completely erased the medieval village from the map.
The Enclosure Acts were undeniably the most socially explosive and physically transformative of the three. Remember the open field village where a single stubborn farmer out of 200 could veto a drainage ditch?
The 100% unanimous consent trap.
Right. Parliament looked at that system and decided it was mathematically incompatible with an industrializing nation. So they changed the rules of the game. With an Enclosure Act, you no longer needed unanimous consent to alter the landscape.
What did you need?
Parliament declared that if villagers representing a sufficient majority of the land's total value, typically around 3/4 or 4/5, signed a petition asking for enclosure, Parliament would pass a law mandating it for everyone.
They took the requirement from 100% down to 80%. They removed the absolute veto.
They destroyed the veto. And once an Enclosure Act passed, a commission of professional surveyors would descend upon the village. They would map out every single scattered strip of wheat, every inch of the shared woods, every grazing right on the common pasture.
Counting every blade of grass.
Literally calculating the exact economic value of everyone's traditional rights. And then they would physically wipe the medieval map clean. They abolished the collective rights entirely. They redrew the map into the modern, distinct, fenced-off, privately owned square farms we recognize today.
Handing each person a private block of land roughly equal to the value of their old scattered rights. And what truly shocked me in the source material is the sheer scale of this operation. Between 1700 and 1830, these three specific types of local acts, estate acts, statutory authority acts, and enclosure acts, made up over half of all legislation passed by the entire British Parliament.
Over 50%.
Over half.
Yeah.
We imagine Parliament during this era doing nothing but debating massive global wars with Napoleon, or arguing over colonial taxes in America. But the data shows that the vast majority of their daily grinding workload was micromanaging the property rights of individual citizens in every corner of the country.
Which leads us directly to the radical hypothesis at the very heart of Bogart and Richardson's research. Looking at this massive volume of legislation, they ask a fundamental provocative question. Was the British Parliament acting as an elastic supply market for property rights?
Okay, we need to translate that. Elastic supply market is pure economist jargon. What does that actually mean in the real world for you and me?
In economics, if the supply of a good is elastic, it simply means that the supplier is highly responsive to the desires of the buyer. If the demand for a product suddenly shoots up, a good elastic factory will immediately spin up its machines and produce more of that product to satisfy the customers without jacking the price up to impossible levels.
Okay, so responsive manufacturing.
Exactly. Bogart and Richardson are proposing a wild idea. What if the British Parliament functioned exactly like a well-run factory, but instead of making shoes, they manufactured property rights?
Wow.
If the British public suddenly realized it was highly profitable to build a toll road or sell a farm and they demanded legal reform, did Parliament just smoothly and efficiently supply the necessary laws? Or, on the other hand, was Parliament just a corrupt, slow-moving club of out-of-touch aristocrats, ignoring the needs of the public and only changing laws when it suited their own rigid class interests?
It is a brilliant framing. Because if it's the latter, if Parliament was just a corrupt rent-extracting institution blocking change unless they got a massive bribe, then the entire story of how capitalism and the Industrial Revolution started has to be rewritten.
Completely rewritten.
But if Parliament actually was a flexible factory, highly responsive to market demand, that changes our entire understanding of history. It means human progress wasn't driven by some sudden romantic philosophical awakening about the rights of man. It was driven by a government willing to sit down and do the tedious paperwork the exact moment the math made sense for the citizens.
Right.
But this brings us to a massive methodological wall. It's a beautifully elegant theory, but how on earth do you prove it? We are talking about the internal human motivations and the bureaucratic efficiency of legislature from 300 years ago. You can't just invent a time machine, walk into a tavern in 1750, and survey the locals on why they petitioned Parliament.
No, you can't ask them. But you can look at their ledgers. You can put the massive historical record of their actions under a quantitative microscope. How do modern economists prove the intent of people who have been dead for centuries? They use data, oceans of data. And specifically, they rely on a concept called proxies.
Proxies, meaning a measurable stand-in for something that is entirely invisible.
Exactly. The researchers want to measure the invisible demand for property rights reform. You cannot put a tape measure on human desire. But you know logically that the demand to change property rights is fundamentally driven by the desire to make money.
Always.
And the desire to make money is heavily dictated by the shifting macroeconomic conditions of the era. So the economists use two massive measurable macroeconomic indicators as proxies for human demand: the overall volume of foreign trade, which represents the general health and opportunity in the economy, and most crucially, the real interest rate.
Okay, the real interest rate. The cost to borrow money. I want to make sure we absolutely nail this concept because it's the engine of the whole paper.
Yeah.
Walk me through the exact math. Why is the national interest rate the ultimate trigger pulling the strings of a landowner in 1720?
Let's do the math from the perspective of our trapped life tenant. You are sitting in your manor house. You want to petition Parliament for an estate act so you can break your grandfather's strict settlement, sell off 100 acres of sheep pasture, and use that cash to build a row of high-end townhouses in London.
Sounds like a solid plan.
Building townhouses requires massive capital. It's a speculative investment. The profitability of that entire endeavor depends completely on the current interest rate. If the national interest rate is sky high, let's say it's hovering around 10% because the government is borrowing heavily to fight a war, then borrowing money to finance construction is incredibly expensive.
Math doesn't work.
You calculate the projected rent from those townhouses, and you realize the income won't even cover the 10% interest on your debt. You will lose money. So what do? You do nothing. You sit in your manor house, you leave the sheep on the pasture, and your demand for an estate act is absolute zero.
But the moment the war ends and the interest rate drops,
the math flips entirely. Let's say peace is declared and the real interest rate plummets down to 3%. Suddenly, capital is dirt cheap. You run the numbers again. At a 3% cost of borrowing, those same London townhouses become a guaranteed absolute gold mine.
you're printing money at that point.
Now, suddenly, you have a massive, urgent, burning financial incentive to break that strict settlement immediately. Your demand for an estate act goes through the roof. You hire the lawyer and send the petition to London tomorrow.
So if the researchers' hypothesis is correct, if Parliament truly is a responsive factory, we should see a massive spike in the number of estate acts past the exact moment interest rates drop.
And that is precisely what the historical data reveals. The researchers ran incredibly complex regression models covering 124 years of daily parliamentary data. And they found an exact, immediate, and mathematically undeniable relationship. The regression coefficient for the real interest rate on estate acts that authorized sales and leases was negative 0.51.
Whoa, stop right there. Regression coefficient of negative 0.51. You're losing me in the economist speak. What does that actually look like if I am staring at a graph?
Think of it as a perfectly balanced mathematical seesaw. The negative number means they move in opposite directions. The moment the side of the seesaw labeled interest rates drops down, the side of the seesaw labeled estate acts passed shoots up into the air.
Okay, that visual helps a lot.
And the 0.51 means the relationship is incredibly strong and predictable. It isn't random noise. When borrowing got cheap, aristocratic families rushed Parliament in a frenzy to break their ancestral wills, and Parliament reliably stamped the approvals. The data proves a cold, calculated, intense mathematical responsiveness.
But I have to play the skeptic here. A historian could look at that graph, see the seesaw, and say, okay, sure, acts went up when interest rates went down. But correlation doesn't equal causation.
The classic trap.
Right. Maybe that's just a coincidence. Interest rates usually drop during peacetime. Maybe during peacetime, Parliament is just less stressed. They aren't debating wars, so they generally just work faster and pass all kinds of laws, not just property laws. How do you know Parliament was specifically reacting to the financial demand and not just in a generally productive mood? How did the researchers prove that?
This is where the methodology of the paper shifts from rigorous to truly elegant. To anticipate that exact skeptical argument, the researchers didn't just look at estate acts, they ran a placebo test.
A placebo test. Like in a pharmaceutical trial where you give half the patients the actual experimental drug
Right.
and you give the other half a sugar pill just to see if the drug is actually doing the work or if it's all in their heads.
Exactly like that.
How on earth do you administer a sugar pill to 18th century laws?
You find a very specific group of laws that went through the exact same parliamentary procedure as the estate acts, cost the exact same amount in legal fees to file, and required the same amount of committee time to debate, but had absolutely nothing to do with property rights, investments, or the broader economy.
How did they find one?
Bogart and Richardson found the perfect historical placebo: non-estate private acts, specifically acts for naturalization and acts for marriage and divorce.
Divorce acts. Wait, if I want to get a divorce in 1750, I have to literally get a private act of parliament passed.
Yes. General divorce laws didn't exist yet for the public. If you wanted a divorce, or if you were a foreign-born merchant living in London who wanted to be naturalized to get the legal rights of a native citizen, you had to petition Parliament for a bespoke private act. These petitions went through the identical bureaucratic machinery as the estate acts.
Okay, so the gears of the machine are the same.
Now, here is the absolute genius of the placebo test. The human desire to get married, or to divorce a miserable spouse, or to become a citizen, is driven by deeply personal life circumstances. It is not driven by the macroeconomic cost of borrowing money.
Right. I am not going to sit at my breakfast table and say, well, I absolutely despise my husband, but I think I'll endure another 5 years of misery until the national interest rate drops to 4% so I can finance the split. That makes zero sense.
It makes no sense at all. So if our skeptic is correct and Parliament was just generally working faster and passing more laws across the board because of low interest rates and peacetime vibes, then we should see a massive spike in divorce and naturalization acts too. The sugar pill should show a positive effect on the graph. But what did the massive data set actually show?
I remember looking at the charts in the paper for this. It was flat, a total flat line.
A completely dead flat line. The
Wow.
correlation between the interest rate and the placebo group of divorce and naturalization acts was essentially zero. The placebo group was completely immune to the macroeconomic fluctuations. This is the absolute smoking gun of the paper. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the wild fluctuation in estate acts wasn't random noise and it wasn't a general parliamentary mood swing. It was a hyper-specific, ruthlessly calculated response by the British public and the British government to exploit economic opportunity.
Stepping back for a second, the implications of this are wild. Does this mean these grand aristocratic families, the lords and earls of England, only decided to sell off grandpa's sacred multi-generational estate when the bank loans got cheap? That sounds incredibly cold. It sounds deeply calculated.
It is cold, it is calculated, and it completely shatters the grand romantic myth of historical progress. We often like to tell ourselves that the shift from the medieval feudal system to modern capitalism was a grand philosophical awakening.
Enlightenment.
We imagine that people suddenly read John Locke, became enlightened about the inherent rights of man and the freedom of property, and bravely cast off the old ways. But the hard data says something much more pragmatic and mercenary. People wanted to modernize strictly when the spreadsheet told them to. They wanted change when the math made sense.
And the government just enabled it.
Exactly. The true genius of the British system wasn't that it forced them to modernize at gunpoint. It was that it built a machine parliament that enabled them to do it the very instant they demanded it.
It's the ultimate slap in the face to the romantic view of history. It wasn't philosophy, it was a spreadsheet. So we see these aristocrats saving their own estates when the math makes sense. But saving an estate doesn't trigger an industrial revolution. You need infrastructure. You need to move the coal and the cotton. Did this same opportunistic math apply to building the nation's physical arteries? Let's look at the Statutory Authority Acts.
If the estate acts were highly responsive, the infrastructure acts were downright explosive. The researchers looked at how statutory authority acts, the laws that created the turnpike roads, the massive canal networks, the harbor improvements, reacted to the macroeconomic proxies. And here they looked heavily at the second proxy, the volume of foreign trade.
Trade volume.
Yeah.
Because that shows the actual physical movement of goods.
Right. Trade volume is a massive tangible indicator of economic pressure. When foreign trade booms, there is intense, immediate pressure to move physical goods quickly across the landscape. If you are importing thousands of heavy bales of raw cotton from the Americas and you have to get them from the port of Liverpool to the spinning mills in the Midlands and then get the finished cloth back to the ports to sell to Europe, a muddy medieval dirt track simply isn't going to cut it.
No, the wagons would just sink.
The profit motive to build a paved toll road or dig a canal becomes enormous.
So when they ran the numbers, what did the regression analysis show for the infrastructure acts?
Absolute, undeniable lockstep. The regression coefficient for trade volume on statutory acts was a massive 0.99.
Nearly a 1-to-1 ratio.
When trade spiked, local communities instantly rushed Parliament to rewrite ancient road tolls and river rights to lay down turnpikes. Furthermore, the correlation with the interest rate was negative 1.1 feen. So when you had the perfect storm trade was booming and capital was cheap to borrow, the legislative machine went into absolute overdrive, churning out infrastructure acts at an astonishing rate.
And I assume the researchers used another placebo test here to prove this wasn't a fluke. What was the sugar pill for the infrastructure acts?
The second placebo group consisted of government finance acts. These were the massive public laws related to national taxes, funding the military, outfitting the Royal Navy, and servicing the national debt. Think about the logic. Does the king's desire to build a new warship or raise a land tax depend on the local foreign trade volumes of a specific port or the profitability of a local canal in Yorkshire?
No. The king's desire to build a warship depends entirely on whether the French or the Spanish are currently shooting at him.
Exactly, and the data beautifully confirms this. Government finance acts only spiked during foreign wars. They were utterly silent, completely unresponsive to the short-term fluctuations in trade and interest rates.
Which proves what, exactly?
This is vital because it proves a massive point. Parliament's daily heavy lifting wasn't just state building from the top down. It wasn't the king imposing a master plan on the nation. It was a legislature highly responsive to the civilian economic hustle from the bottom up.
Parliament isn't an ivory tower. It's a clearinghouse for local hustle. I love that. But I have to stop you here because we need to talk about the enclosures. You mentioned earlier that smashing the open field villages was the most socially transformative part of this entire era. How did the Enclosure Acts react to the interest rates? Because we are talking about chopping up the ancient commons, effectively erasing a way of life.
The enclosures showed the strongest, most violent mathematical reaction of all. The regression coefficient for the interest rate on Enclosure Acts was a massive negative 2.07.
Negative 2.07. So we're talking double the sensitivity of the infrastructure acts.
Easily. The paper notes an incredible statistic. A 1 standard deviation decline in the interest rate explained 73% of the standard deviation change in Enclosure Acts.
Okay, standard deviation. Let's translate that. We are talking about massive, undeniable swings in the data, not just minor statistical noise. You're saying that 73% of the massive booms in enclosing land can be explained simply by the cost of borrowing money dropping.
Yes. Think about what this means on the actual ground. When interest rates dropped, making large-scale agricultural investments like deep tile drainage, new plows, or complex crop rotation highly profitable, the leading landowners in these medieval villages acted with absolute ruthless efficiency. They didn't hesitate. They immediately gathered the 80% consensus, petitioned Parliament, and chopped up the commons to privatize the farms.
I have to pause here because we are throwing around words like efficiency and market demand, but we need to acknowledge the human reality of this. On the ground, this means a family who has grazed their sheep on that common land for 400 years, whose entire survival depends on gathering firewood from that shared forest, wakes up one morning and is suddenly staring at a newly built wooden fence.
It's devastating.
And they are told, sorry, by Act of Parliament, you are locked out. We're talking about kicking peasants off their ancestral land so large-scale, hyper-efficient capitalist farming can take over. The brutality of that is stunning.
It was a profound social trauma. The enclosure movement created a massive class of landless laborers who were forced to migrate to the filthy, overcrowded cities to work in the new factories simply to survive. It was the birth of the urban industrial working class.
The dark side of progress.
The economic progress of the nation was built on the dislocation of the rural poor. The paper doesn't deny this trauma. Rather, it highlights the terrifying mechanical efficiency with which the British state executed it. When the macroeconomic indicators signaled that privatization would yield higher crop outputs, the parliament supplied the legal force to make it happen rapidly and without sentimentality.
Think of the interest rates as a giant invisible hand. The exact moment the rate drops, the hand reaches down from the sky, scoops up millions of acres of medieval shared village land, instantly slices it up into private modern farms, and displaces thousands of people. It's capitalism moving at light speed, and Parliament was the blade doing the slicing.
It's a vivid analogy, and it perfectly captures the speed and responsiveness that set Britain apart. But in the realm of high-level economics, whenever you have two variables moving in perfect lockstep like trade booming and Parliament passing infrastructure acts simultaneously, you have to confront the ultimate academic bogeyman, the endogeneity problem.
The endogeneity problem. Let's break that down. We're talking about causality, right? The classic chicken or the egg dilemma.
Exactly. Any rigorous skeptic or peer reviewer of this paper will immediately look at the data and say, wait a minute, are you absolutely sure that a boom in trade caused Parliament to pass the acts? Isn't it just as likely that Parliament passing the acts, building the roads, digging the canals, expanding the ports, is what caused the trade boom in the first place? Which way does the arrow of time actually point?
Right. If you build a massive new canal, trade is obviously going to go up.
Yeah.
That's common sense. So how on earth do the researchers prove that it was the demand from the economy driving the laws rather than the laws driving the economy? You can't just run a simple math equation if both things are constantly causing each other in a loop.
This is where the paper crosses from brilliant analysis into absolute jaw-dropping genius territory. To solve the chicken or the egg problem, econometricians use a highly complex technique involving instrumental variables.
Instrumental variables, another big term. What does the ELI5 explain? Like I'm 5 version of an instrumental variable.
Imagine you want to measure the exact shape of an object, but you aren't allowed to touch it or look at it directly because it's moving too fast. Instead, you find a bright light, shine it on the object, and meticulously measure the shadow it casts on the wall. The shadow is your instrumental variable.
I love that.
In economics, you need to find a third variable, something completely independent, something entirely outside of human control that heavily affects trade, but cannot possibly be affected by Parliament passing a law.
Something exogenous, completely outside the system.
Right. And what did Bogart and Richardson use as their light source to cast the shadow? They asked the trees. They used historical tree rings.
Tree rings. Okay, I need you to break this down for me step by step because it sounds like literal magic. How do the concentric rings in a piece of dead wood prove that the British Parliament was an elastic market for property rights?
Let's trace the causal chain, link by link. In the 18th century, the global economy was still overwhelmingly fundamentally agricultural. Even global trade was largely the movement of agricultural products: grain, timber, wool, tobacco, raw cotton. Therefore, the total volume of trade in any given year was heavily, directly dependent on the size of the harvest.
That makes perfect sense. If you have a bumper crop, you have thousands of tons of excess grain to load onto ships and sell. Trade goes up. If you have a terrible harvest, everyone is hoarding food just to survive. There's nothing to export, and trade crashes.
Exactly. And what is the single biggest determining factor for the size of a harvest? The weather, the temperature, the rainfall, the hours of sunshine. Now, here's the crucial part. Parliament can pass all the laws it wants. It can decree eminent domain, it can smash ancestral wills, it can enclose every village in the country, but the British Parliament cannot control the weather.
The ultimate exogenous variable. King George and his ministers couldn't pass a law to make it rain.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, how do we, sitting in the 21st century, know the exact localized weather patterns year by year in the 1700s? We look at dendrochronology. We look at tree rings. A wide tree ring means a year with excellent weather conditions conducive to heavy growth, which perfectly correlates with a great agricultural harvest.
And a narrow ring.
A narrow, cramped ring means drought, extreme cold, or pestilence, which means a terrible harvest. The researchers gathered massive existing scientific data sets of historical tree ring measurements, but they didn't just look at trees growing in England. They looked at tree rings from France, from Belgium, from Poland, and even across the Atlantic in colonial America, specifically New York and Virginia.
Wait, why look at trees in Virginia and Poland to understand the British Parliament? That seems, I don't know, a bit far removed.
Because those regions were Great Britain's major global trading partners. The weather in colonial Virginia dictated the size of the tobacco and cotton harvest that fueled the British merchant fleets. The weather in Pomerania, near the Baltic Sea, dictated the massive grain exports that Britain relied on to feed its growing cities. By mapping the tree rings across all these specific global regions, the researchers created an undeniable, biologically independent index of historical weather.
And that weather perfectly predicted the exogenous shocks to global trades.
Exactly.
This is a massive aha moment. It's giving me chills.
Right.
So they used the biology of the trees to say, look, the tree rings proved the weather in Virginia was absolutely perfect in 1790. This perfect weather caused a massive bumper crop of cotton, which caused a massive unavoidable spike in British shipping and trade. And then they look at what Parliament did.
Yes. They run a complex statistical model called a two-stage least squares regression. Don't worry about the math, just know what it proves. They show that when the tree rings dictate an exogenous, weather-driven boom in trade, there is an immediate subsequent spike in statutory authority acts being passed in London.
The causal chain is irrefutably established.
Irrefutable. Nature dictates the weather dictates the harvest dictates the trade volume. The trade boom creates massive, sudden profit opportunities for merchants. The local merchants petition Parliament for roads to move the goods, and Parliament supplies the acts. The arrow of causation undeniably points from the natural economy up to the legislature.
That is just phenomenal. It is taking dendrochronology, the pure science of trees, and using it to definitively settle a debate about human political economy. But I want to take this out of the abstract data, out of the regressions, and look at how this machine actually functioned on the muddy ground. Give me a real-world story. Because we are talking about hundreds of acts being passed. How fast could Parliament actually move when a crisis or a massive opportunity hit? The paper mentions the Lancashire cotton miracle. Walk me through exactly what happened there.
This is one of the most vivid historical examples in the entire paper of how astonishingly elastic the British system was. Imagine it is the year 1792. Across the English Channel, the French Revolution is raging in full force. The political chaos leads to a massive naval blockade of French ports. France's highly lucrative textile manufacturing sector takes a devastating hit.
A massive gap in the market.
Suddenly, there's a massive void in the global market for cloth. To fill that void, British cotton exports go entirely hyperbolic. The epicenter of this sudden, massive boom is the region of Manchester in Lancashire. They are spinning yarn and weaving cotton cloth at rates the world has never seen.
But there's a physical problem, right? The bottleneck.
A massive, crippling physical bottleneck. In 1792, the mills in Manchester are booming, but the roads connecting the textile towns to the ports are essentially medieval mud tracks. They simply cannot physically handle the sheer volume of heavy wagons loaded with raw cotton coming in and the finished cloth going out. The wagons are sinking, the goods are rotting.
Oh, no.
By 1793, the exact next year, the entire booming city of Manchester is facing commercial paralysis simply because of the mud.
So what do the mill owners do? Do they spend 10 years in local courts trying to get permission from local aristocrats to build a paved road through their estates?
No. They activate the parliamentary machine. In 1793, the desperate entrepreneurs and local leaders of Lancashire slammed Parliament with more Turnpike Act requests than they had submitted in the entire previous decade combined. They needed the power of eminent domain, they needed the legal right to set up tolls to pay for the paving stones, and they needed it yesterday or the boom would collapse.
And how did Parliament react to this sudden, massive wave of complex legal paperwork? Remember, we're talking about a legislative body in the late 1700s operated by candlelight, writing on parchment with quill pens, without telegraphs or typewriters.
Yeah.
Did they form an exploratory committee? Did they delay? Did they create a 10-year backlog?
They approved all of them almost instantly.
Wait, all of them?
All of them. Within months, Parliament processed the massive stack of petitions, held the necessary committee hearings, listened to the token opposition, set the legal compensation for the displaced landowners, and passed the acts. Think about the alternative. If the parliamentary procedure had been rigid, if they had dragged their feet, debated the philosophy of road ownership, or delayed for even a single year, the Manchester cotton miracle could have choked to death on its own success.
But the supply of property rights was perfectly dynamically elastic. The machine worked exactly as demanded.
It worked flawlessly under immense pressure.
It's staggering. It is the equivalent of a modern tech startup pivoting its entire business model overnight. But we are talking about the sprawling British Empire. And this elasticity wasn't just happening up north in the gritty industrial towns. The paper has an incredible story about London itself expanding, right? The Tuffnell Act of 1766. This is the perfect ground-level example of the Estate Act breaking the ancestors' curse.
Exactly. Let's move to London. The city is booming, rapidly becoming the wealthiest and most populated metropolis in the world. It desperately needs to expand outward to house the growing middle class. We meet a man named George Forster Tufnell. He owns a massive, highly desirable tract of land in Islington, right on the immediate periphery of the encroaching city. Real estate developers are desperate to build high-end townhouses on his fields.
But Tufnell is trapped. He is a life tenant.
He is completely trapped. His ancestors' will explicitly forbids him from granting long-term leases. Now, no sane real estate developer is going to spend a fortune building expensive brick townhouses if they can only get a 10-year lease on the land beneath them.
Obviously not.
They need guaranteed 99-year leases to ensure a return on their massive investment. Tufnell is sitting on an absolute gold mine, but he legally cannot hand anyone a shovel.
So we wait for the macroeconomic trigger to fire the machine.
Yep. Right. In the early 1760s, Britain is embroiled in the 7 Years' War. Because of the massive government borrowing to fund the military, interest rates are sky-high, hovering over 5%. Private lending practically ceases, so Tufnell does nothing. He watches the fields.
Just waiting.
But in 1765, the war ends. The yield on government bonds plummets to about 3.25%. Suddenly, the London building boom kicks into absolute overdrive. Capital is cheap and flowing freely. Tufnell sees his window of maximum profit.
He hires the lawyer and petitions Parliament.
He submits his petition. He explicitly states in his documentation that he has a fair prospect to make a considerable improvement to the estate, but is utterly disabled by the dead hand of the will. And what does Parliament do? They don't lecture him on family tradition. They shatter his ancestors' will.
Just like that.
They swiftly pass Private Act 6, George III, Chapter 45, a bespoke law specifically granting Tufnell the legal right to sign 99-year leases. Immediately, the developers move in, the bricks are laid, and modern London expands right over his ancestral land, making Tufnell incredibly wealthy.
Okay, hearing all these stories, Tufnell breaking the will, the canal companies taking land, the villagers getting kicked off the commons, this raises an incredibly important question. I have to push back hard here, because this sounds deeply disturbing from a modern legal perspective.
I know where you're going with this.
If Parliament could just shatter your grandfather's sacred will whenever it felt like it, or if a canal company could just march in and take a farmer's land using a Statutory Authority Act, doesn't that fundamentally mean property rights in Britain were actually incredibly insecure? We are constantly taught by economists that the absolute foundation of a strong capitalist economy is strict, ironclad property rights. A man's home is his castle. But you were telling me Parliament was just rewriting the rules and taking land on a whim?
You have hit on what is perhaps the most brilliant, defining paradox of the entire British system. The modern definition of secure property rights is often totally misunderstood when applied to history. In the British system, the physical property itself, the specific acreage, the dirt, the traditional right to hold the land exactly as your ancestors had always held it, was not sacred. It was, in fact, highly insecure.
They could just take it.
Parliament could and absolutely would take your land or change your rules if the broader economy demanded it.
So if the land wasn't secure, what was secure? Why didn't people just revolt?
Income. The market value was secure. When Parliament broke an estate act, or authorized an enclosure, or granted the superpower of eminent domain, they were absolutely fanatical about fair economic compensation.
Compensation.
If they took a farmer's land to dig a canal, the legal commission ensured the farmer was paid a highly competitive, fair market price for that land. If they enclosed a village, the surveyors spent months meticulously calculating the exact economic value of every single villager's strip of land and grazing rights to ensure they received an equivalent monetary value in the new, privatized setup. Parliament valued the market potential of the land over the dead hand of tradition.
I see the distinction. So they weren't protecting the physical thing, they were protecting the wealth generated by the thing.
Precisely. They protected the income stream, not the physical artifact. Parliament provided absolute security for the financial value derived from property, but they believed that the rules defining who could use that property and how they could use it must remain pliable. They must adapt to new technological conditions. If a piece of land was vastly more valuable to the nation as a canal than as a sheep pasture, the law facilitated the change, but it fully compensated the shepherd. That is the definition of institutional elasticity.
Which brings us full circle to the incredibly striking image we started with. Britain versus France. Because this exact institutional elasticity, this ability to pivot, is exactly why Britain left France in the dust. I remember reading in the sources about how France tried to build their own canal networks, too. They weren't stupid. They knew they needed infrastructure to compete. What happened when the French tried to build a canal?
It was a catastrophic masterclass in rigidity. In France, the traditional feudal property rights of the local aristocrats were considered absolute and inviolable. The local parliaments and courts fiercely defended the physical property rights against any central encroachment from Paris.
So they couldn't just pass an act.
Not at all. If a French engineering company wanted to build a canal to move coal, a single, stubborn local lord who simply didn't want a dirty canal going through his pristine hunting grounds could tie the entire project up in court for decades.
It's the ultimate unanimous consent trap we saw in the English villages, but elevated to the national level.
Exactly. France had the brilliant engineering, they had the massive capital, but they totally lacked the legal mechanism to override local holdouts. Their grand infrastructure projects languished in endless, suffocating litigation.
While Britain just kept building.
Britain just passed a Statutory Authority Act, handed the holdout a bag of money representing a fair price, whether he liked it or not, and dug the canal. Britain achieved a massive, peaceful reorganization of its national property through a flexible parliamentary market. France remained utterly trapped by inflexible dogmatic laws until the societal pressure built so high that it exploded in the bloody, violent, completely uncompensated expropriations of the French Revolution.
It is a stunning historical takeaway. Britain's secret superpower wasn't the coal in the ground, and it wasn't the steam engine. It was a parliament that acted as an efficient, highly elastic market for rewriting the rules of the game to fit the modern era. They had the ability to legally update the operating system without crashing the entire computer.
And that is the true, enduring definition of institutional resilience. It's the capacity to peacefully, systematically tear down the strict settlements of the past to make way for the future, while still protecting the core economic value of the individuals involved.
Which brings us to the ultimate test of that resilience today. Because as we wrap up this deep dive into the 18th century, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought that pulls everything we just learned directly into the present moment. 300 years ago, British society was choking on the ancestors' curse-outdated, rigid land laws that trapped capital, paralyzed infrastructure, and empowered stubborn holdouts to block progress. Today, we are facing a terrifyingly similar bottleneck, but it isn't made of dirt, sheep, and parchment. It is made of data, code, and servers.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the rapidly evolving digital age we are living in right now. Think about the massive data sets required to train artificial intelligence. Think about the sprawling global copyright disputes over who owns a digital likeness or a piece of code. Think about the walled gardens of digital privacy and the locked intellectual property that prevents different technologies from talking to each other. These digital restrictions are the new strict settlements.
That's a fascinating comparison.
The internet is full of modern, open-field villages where technological progress is trapped by millions of conflicting, absolute digital rights, where a few holdouts can block a massive innovation.
It is a profound, almost eerie parallel. The physical enclosure movement of the 18th century that birthed the Industrial Revolution is being directly mirrored by a massive digital enclosure movement today.
Exactly. So the question we leave you with is this. Do we have an institution today capable of rewriting the rules of digital property as cleanly and elastically as the British Parliament did for physical land? Is there a legal mechanism out there that can smash through the digital holdouts, fairly and accurately compensate the original creators, and build the infrastructure of the future? Or are we going to end up exactly like 18th century France, paralyzed by endless, decades-long lawsuits, clinging desperately to the absolute rights of the past while the future simply passes us by?
It's the ultimate test of our era. The technological hardware of the future is already here, sitting on the servers. The question is whether our legal software is hopelessly out of date.
Keep questioning the invisible systems running in the background of your world. Because sometimes the most powerful force in history isn't the roaring machine, it's the quiet paperwork that allows the machine to be built.